Schanzer, and I'm an affiliated faculty with the Duke American Grand Strategy Program. And we are thrilled to continue our online programming this week with a very special guest who's here to talk about an incredibly timely topic. He is Yossi Klein Halevi. His official title is Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, but he is a leading public intellectual in Israel, a columnist, an author of many award-winning books, most recently one called entitled Letters from My Palestinian Neighbor. He teams up with our esteemed friend and colleague Abdullah Antepli to run a very important program called the Muslim Leadership Institute through the Shalom Hartman Institute, and they are joint partners in that important program. So we are thrilled to welcome Yossi to speak with us this afternoon, live from Israel, and you can see it's evening there. Yossi, welcome.
Well, thank you, David. Wonderful to be with you. And Melanie, thank you for all your help. And Abdullah, I'm delighted to be back with you in whatever form.
Even if we have to be so far apart, it's great to make these connections. Yossi, I wanted to start off, as I mentioned, of course, the world is, we want to talk about things other than COVID, but I think it's also important for us to get a feel for the experiences that people in other countries are facing. We can be very myopic about this, and so it'd be interesting to learn a little bit, how is Israel coping? What is the extent of your kind of shelter-in-place, stay-at-home orders? How did Israel manage the celebration of a very important holiday, very communal holiday like Passover, which is just ending there maybe an hour or so ago?
Right. Well, we've been under lockdown in one form or another for the last month. The lockdown, especially during the holiday season, has been very strict. People have been forbidden to have group seders. You could only have your communal Passover experience with whoever you're living with, and that's been strictly reinforced. There have been police blockades between cities. The highways have been completely empty. We are permitted to go out of the home for what the official regulations say are 100 meters. But this is Israel and everything is flexible. So, but generally speaking, the lockdown has been effective. And what we did here very early on and very effectively was more or less shut the country down to outside, to tourists to travel with rare exceptions. And we were able to do that because first of all, because we're a small country. And secondly, because we're used to living under siege. We don't have normal relations really with any of our neighbors, even with those neighbors like Egypt and Jordan that we are technically at peace with. It's not hard to shut down the borders. And so we've been able to do what you couldn't do in the States and certainly couldn't do in Europe. And we did it very, very early on. So we moved quickly. The mortality rate has been among the lowest in the West, if not the lowest. But there are pockets of worry, and that's what we're watching in the coming days.
So, of course, as we're struggling through this period of lockdown around the world, everyone is beginning to think about and talk about, what our next phase can look like, and how we can begin to open up at a reasonable level of health risk. Of course, Israel's thinking about that as well. And I thought it was very interesting. I noted early, a number of weeks ago, I think it was the Attorney General approved for the Shin Bet to essentially deploy a technology, a capability that had been used principally for counterterrorism for pandemic control. And that is a system that used location data for to both enforce quarantine against individuals who were, I guess, had been labeled or determined to be sick, and also to identify other individuals who might have been in contact with that person to also require them to be in quarantine. And there's a lot of discussion here in the United States about how we might use similar technologies to move forward and begin to open up. And so it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about your thoughts about how that has worked in Israel, and also concerns or issues relating to both privacy and civil liberties.
Well, when that decision was announced, many of us were very concerned. And the reason is that this current Netanyahu government is not, shall we say, a paragon of democratic norms. It's not a stickler for upholding the niceties of the refinements of democracy. And so there began a struggle between the Knesset, our parliament, where the opposition actually has a majority. And I'll unpack that in a moment, because it's a very complicated question. If they're a majority, why are they still the opposition? And there is, the opposition technically has a majority now. And the government did not want to cede control over authority over the Shin Bet to the Knesset. The Knesset insisted that its subcommittee on intelligence monitor this new and potentially worrying development. And it went to the Supreme Court, as these conflicts usually do. The court ruled in favor of the Knesset, and so we now have parliamentary oversight over this new shift. So I think that we have managed to find a reasonable solution. The fact that the Knesset is in the hands of the opposition, the liberal opposition, means that the oversight will be most likely adequate and trustworthy. Beyond that, the structural weaknesses of the Israeli system, which we've really been experiencing in a very drastic way last year. We've had 3 national elections within a single year. It's astonishing and unprecedented. I can't think of another democracy that's been subjected to that kind of institutional abuse that we've gone through here. So those structural weaknesses remain, but at least on this particular issue, I feel that we're in reasonably good hands.
So with the Knesset overseeing it, I was just wondering how society, individuals, you're saying that gives them enough assurance to feel that it's going to be used in a appropriate and not inappropriate way in the future. And so, but the people are accepting essentially this, the rulings of an app or of some sort of location data system that is tracking them and also having some significant consequences for them if somebody is put in quarantine.
Yeah, well, you know, it's complicated here because there's a video clip that's gone viral that shows a police raid on an ultra-Orthodox radio station where 2 men were conducting prayers because you don't have public prayers anymore. That's the synagogues have all been shut down. But they've been doing this through the radio, and I actually found that very moving, and found it a reasonable solution to the need of many people here for some form of communal prayer expression. And it was quite a shocking scene to see the police rushing in, dismantling the microphones, and treating these 2 men as criminals. So I can't say that we have found a happy balance yet. We are in completely uncharted territories. Police the police do as police do. anywhere, and police can't be given unlimited control, whether it's the Shin Bet or the policeman on the beat.
Well, I think we're in for a roiling debate about this in all democracies, but certainly here to come in the United States as well. So it's something for all of us to keep our eyes on. And I've been thinking about that a lot, teaching a course on privacy technology and national security this semester at Duke. So one other issue I wanted to bring up, we're going to get into the whole issue relating to Israel and Palestine. But I've been thinking about looking what's happening in New York, and then thinking about Gaza, and thinking about a highly dense urban area with very undeveloped healthcare, with a real potential humanitarian disaster right on Israel's border. I'm wondering what you have been thinking about in terms of that, what the Israeli government trying to think ahead of the curve when this virus inevitably comes in a big way to a place as densely populated as Gaza. What happens? Who's responsible?
Yeah, well, look, so far we've all been very lucky. The numbers in Gaza have been very low, but obviously that's not something to build policy on. The complications there are further factor is that Hamas is in control of Gaza, and Hamas has, of course, no relationships, not even indirect relationship, with Israel. With the Palestinian Authority, which is in some form of control in parts of the West Bank, there is, I would say, good control, good cooperation between Israeli health authorities and PA health authorities. And we're seeing that cooperation deepen, and that's a very interesting trend to watch, and to see whether that might have political consequences the morning after Corona. In Gaza, I'm much less hopeful, even though there have been some tentative exchanges between the Israeli health system and the Gaza health system. That apparently is being allowed in very small dosages by the Hamas government. Medical supplies are going in to Gaza. That is not at all being impeded. But the question really is what happens if, God forbid, there's a major breakout. Now, Gaza borders two countries, neither of which has real relations with Hamas. Egypt is southern border, and so the question really is if there will be a major breakout, will Egypt and Israel come together to salvage the situation? That's my most optimistic scenario. Hamas will not accept Israeli aid in any significant form directly, but perhaps in conjunction with Egypt. And that might, again, if we're looking at the morning after, that might open up some new possibilities as well. So if one is looking for a silver lining in this very black cloud, there are possibilities.
And maybe from what you're saying, Gaza's isolation from the world is actually working in its favor, at least in the early stages of this pandemic.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Yes.
All right. Well, let's turn to what's on everybody's mind, which is the very fluid situation in Israeli politics. You mentioned the three elections in less than a year's time. The first two, of course, all three were inconclusive, with Blue and White and Likud either tying or coming within a couple seats of each other. And the first two instances, neither side being able to form a government, leading to new elections. And then the very shocking development after the third election, of blue and white, Benny Gantz agreeing to a tentative agreement to go into a unity government with Netanyahu and Likud. But the devil has been in the details, and that agreement to form a unity government, which was announced with a lot of fanfare, has not yet come to fruition. And as I understand it, a special 2-day extension has been granted to the parties to try to continue. So maybe you could update us on where things stand with respect to the unity government and what it would, if the deal goes through as we suspect it probably will, what will that government look like?
So a couple points as background about what this moment means politically for Israel. And I think the first point that needs to be emphasized, especially for people abroad who I don't think have sufficiently internalized the transformation of Israeli politics in the last generation, really, since the second intifada of the early 2000s, is that Israeli politics is no longer divided between right and left as it has been since the country. We are now divided between the right and the center. Now, what that means in a practical sense is that the gap between the two parties, the blue and white centrist party and the Likud on the right, is not as insurmountable as the gap between the left and the right. They can form a unity government on certain shared principles, even though I'm not minimizing substantial disagreements between them, especially on questions like annexing parts of the West Bank, which I think is really the crucial issue that is in some way impeding the emergence of a unity government. But the biggest obstacle between the Likud and blue and white is the person of Benjamin Netanyahu. Blue and white is a coalition that was formed for only one purpose, and that is to unseat a prime minister who was perceived, from my point of view, rightly, as being an increasing danger to Israeli democracy. The first genuine danger to Israeli democracy that I think we've ever experienced. And coming from the top, that has made that very frightening. Now, of course, you in America wouldn't know what that experience is like to have a president who threatens democratic norms. But just use your imagination for a moment and bear with me, because it's a very frightening experience to have a prime minister in a democracy whose commitment to democracy is continuous. And so this was a kind of a sacred political mission that blue and white undertook, which was to galvanize the democratic forces from whatever remained of the Israeli left, from the center, and even to some extent from the right, because blue and white also attracted some significant right-wing figures who felt that Netanyahu is simply a danger to the fabric of the country. And so for Benny Gantz to turn around after election number 3 and to tell those of us who followed him after one election after another, dutifully went back to the ballot, and were ready to go to number 4. We're ready to go to as many rounds as necessary to get rid of this guy. And then Benny Gantz turns around and abruptly dismantles the blue and white coalition, one part of the coalition refusing to negotiate with Netanyahu, saying we can continue to oppose Netanyahu from outside the government and support whatever moves the government needs to do on Corona. And then Benny Gantz turning around and saying, no, wait a minute, we are in a national crisis. We can't continue to be in a limbo. We need a functioning government. And I have to tell you, as somebody who is a passionate centrist and who has waited for years for the emergence of a credible centrist party that could challenge the right and be the party of government. I'm devastated by the disintegration of blue and white. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I am also relieved that Benny Gantz took this, to my mind, very courageous step. Whether he has negotiated against Netanyahu in an effective way or not is a separate question. And it's maddening to see how amateurish he's been. He should have had all of the major issues negotiated and sealed before even announcing the possibility of a unity government, because he's dealing with our most unscrupulous and untrustworthy politicians. So there is a great deal of concern that Gantz, who is, I believe, a very well-intentioned man, but possibly in over his head in the messy business of Israeli politics. He really might have given Netanyahu far more than the prime minister should come out with. Now, the real question here is salvaging the judicial system. This is the red line for Benny Gantz in negotiations. He appears to be willing to cede his demand that a bill be passed barring anyone who is facing criminal indictment from serving as prime minister, which of course is Netanyahu. He seems to be willing to cede that to Netanyahu in exchange for control over the justice ministry, which Netanyahu appears to be willing to do. The question will be in the fine print. How much control will blue and white have over the judicial system? Is the Likud really prepared to step back and allow the credibility of the judicial system to be restored? Because that, to my mind, the greatest crime that Netanyahu has committed politically against Israeli democracy, and to undermine the authority of the court. We have one of the finest courts in the world, and Netanyahu has declared war against it.
So blue and white has broken apart, and so it would be a very junior partner. And as I understand, the entire right-wing bloc, many of the religious parties and the settler parties would be part of the coalition. So how does blue and white, being the junior partner, how would it be able to essentially impose its will once essentially Israel gets through this phase and the government continues to be run by Prime Minister Netanyahu, I guess, for the next 18 months?
Well, one of the truly impressive achievements that Gantz seems to have won in these negotiations is an unprecedented number of cabinet positions, given the size of his party. It's almost as if virtually every one of his parliamentary list is going to be a cabinet minister. It isn't quite that, but it's approaching that. And so he will have considerable clout at the cabinet table. The good news from my point of view is that the pro-settler party, which is a small party, one of the smaller parties in the Knesset, but nevertheless crucial for the right-wing coalition, appears to be set on heading into the opposition. If this coalition happens, they will quit the government. And that's very good news. It means a weakening of the right-wing religious bloc. And again, if one is looking at long-term political trends, this could augur well for a softening, a blurring of the sharp divisions between center and right that we've been experiencing. So the question is, for centrist voters like me, there are two problems. One is the political clout of the settlers. The other is the political clout of the ultra-Orthodox. Now, in many people's minds abroad, the two are conflated. These are two very different communities. The ultra-Orthodox tend not to be very interested in political issues that don't directly affect the well-being of their separatist community. They're really interested in maintaining their religious institutions and ensuring continued government subsidy for yeshiva students, for those who are studying in religious academies full-time, and for ensuring the ongoing exemption from the draft for their young men, which of course is a maddening situation for those of us whose children go to the army. And there really is this profound imbalance in shouldering the civic responsibilities of a country that is under permanent siege. So these are the issues, and the trade-off that we seem to be getting with this, if this unity government emerges. And I have to really qualify that because nothing has been signed. And again, we're dealing with a highly untrustworthy figure. Netanyahu may very well have made the decision that he actually is not going to go for a unity government. And what he's already achieved is destroying the coherence and credibility of the opposition party. It's now fractured into three. There are now, instead of blue and white, there are now three separate parties, splinters that have disintegrated from this whole. And so there are credible political commentators in this country who believe that Netanyahu intended all along to lead Benny Gantz on, to reach the point where they can't have an agreement, and meanwhile to have destroyed the opposition, and then go to election number 4. I hope, obviously, that that's not the case. A fourth election during a health emergency might be one election too many to sustain the credibility of institutions. And I worry not only about the literal health of Israeli society, but of our social and political.
Well, thank you for really illuminating the details of this situation. It's very, very helpful. I know it requires some speculation when you don't know what form of government you're going to have in a couple of hours. It's hard to tell substantively what that government might do, but I do want to bring us to this question of annexation and relations with the Palestinians, and bring in the whole idea of the Trump plan. I don't like to call it a peace plan because I don't really think it was in the form of anything like a prior peace plan. I just kind of see it as a unilateral restatement or a change in U.S. policy that Israel is now interpreting as, you know, a green light to do some things that in the past the U.S. government wouldn't let it do. So I'll call it the U.S. policy statement or the Trump policy statement. Where do you see things going on this issue? I guess there's two scenarios. If we have a unity government, what has Gantz negotiated, and what steps might be taken in a unilateral fashion by Israel in the territories? And then if it falls apart and the Netanyahu government is moving towards a fourth election, you know, what can they do? What might they do in the short run on these issues?
David, if I could just say a few words about the Trump plan and then its potential consequences. The Trump plan might have been useful if it was presented as an interim agreement and as an interim plan to help get us back on track. There were some very interesting elements in there. As a final status agreement, I certainly agree with you, it's a dead end. It did have the benefit of being a wake-up call for both the Israeli right and for the Palestinian leadership. It was a wake-up call for the right in the sense that even the most pro-right-wing American administration in the history of American-Israeli relations nevertheless came out with a plan that called for some form of Palestinian statehood. And that was actually a profound shock for the settlement movement, whose leaders are vehemently opposed to the plan. That has not quite filtered back into the international discourse about the plan. But I think it's a very important point to emphasize.
Wasn't it so conditional that conditions that the Palestinian entity, would almost never have been able to achieve, such that you could say that it really didn't envision that, or
yes, but what frightened the settler leaders, and I think rightly so, is that the Trump plan has reinforced the very concept of a two-state solution. If even the Trump administration has endorsed some form, however unworkable, for a Palestinian state, that means that the idea of a Palestinian state has really penetrated the international community to such an extent that even the skeptics on the right in the White House have endorsed the principle, if not quite the mechanics. So I think that was a point that tended to be overlooked and was certainly not overlooked by the Israeli right, which is deeply divided over the Trump plan. The other piece of that is that many of the settlements, even though the Trump plan called for leaving all the settlements in place, what the settlement leaders understood is that the Trump plan would leave no room for expansion for settlements that were embedded deeply within a future Palestinian state. They would be effectively surrounded by a Palestinian state and absorbed. And this terrifies the settler league. So this was a wake-up call, in a sense, for parts of the Israeli right, that it is premature to eulogize the two-state solution. For Palestinian leaders, I believe this was a different kind of wake-up call. That is that every time the Palestinian leadership rejects a peace plan, and here we're going back to the 1930s and 40s and then the year 2000, the map of the next plan is always smaller, the map of a future Palestinian state. And so time is not necessarily on the side of the Palestinian national movement. So in that sense, I see the Trump plan as having been a useful exercise in instilling a certain amount of humility within some of the players here. Whether that's actually been the result or not is a different question.
Insights are great. Could you also tell us what is happening, what is likely, or I know it takes prediction, but what is on the table in terms of steps that Israel might take in the next phase?
Right. Well, so Netanyahu is determined to exploit the presence of a sympathetic administration to leave as his legacy the annexation of Israeli settlements, the extension of Israeli law to the settlements. Now, the blue and white party is in principle not opposed. I'm trying to phrase this in as complicated a way as possible. It is in principle not opposed to the extension of Israeli law to some settlements, not to all. The settlements that we refer to as settlement blocks, which are close to the pre-1967 border, and which in any likely two-state solution would be annexed by Israel in exchange for territory within pre-1967 Israel with land swap. That is something that I think Benny Gantz willing to cede. I personally think it's a very serious misstep. Do that unilaterally risks breaking down whatever relations we have with the Palestinian Authority. And we have very complicated and deep security relations, which have been maintained through many ups and downs in the peace process. We have relations in all kinds of ways. We spoke earlier about the connections between our two health systems, so that there is an infrastructure in place that, in times of emergency like this, can be affected. If we unilaterally annex anything, even settlements that everyone knows, Palestinians, Israelis, that these are almost certainly going to be part of Israel in a future agreement, that risks the very delicate fabric of the relationships that we have now. The most worrying step of annexation that Netanyahu seems committed to doing is annexing the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is that strip of territory that is at the very eastern edge of the West Bank, and that is the border between the West Bank and the Kingdom of Jordan. I can see it clearly from where I'm sitting now. My apartment is literally the last row of houses at the edge of Jerusalem, and in the very clear distance, I can see the lights of the Jordan Valley. And so we're talking about a geographic intimacy that is very problematic from a security point of view. And so the temptation on Israel's part is to stake a permanent claim there. The problem is, leaving aside what that would mean in terms of our relations with the Palestinians, it will likely lead to a collapse of our relations with Jordan. And this is very complicated because behind the scenes, Jordan wants a continued Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley. Everyone knows it. But Israel cannot make that explicit politically. We can translate a military necessity, and we do have a military necessity for safeguarding our easternmost border. If you think about what's beyond our eastern border, we're looking beyond Jordan, at Iraq, at Syria. And so we do need, for the foreseeable future, to maintain a military presence there. But to extend Israeli law to the Jordan Valley is a very dangerous move. And then the question is, well, are we going to give, let's assume that we do that. Doesn't Netanyahu intend to extend Israeli citizenship for Palestinians who live in the Jordan Valley? So these are the questions that worry me when I look at the maneuverings. And I don't know if Benny Gantz is strong enough. And I don't only mean in terms of his backbone, but I also mean politically, because even though Netanyahu, and here's where things get even more complicated, Netanyahu does not have a majority for his bloc to become prime minister, but he does have a majority for annexation. There is one party, a right-wing party, that is anti-Netanyahu and that has sided with Gantz, but on this issue is likely to side with Netanyahu. So I don't know how much maneuverability Gantz really.
Fascinating, and very, very, very helpful. I have, of course, a million more questions. We could go all day, but I want to open it up to our audience, and I want to turn to our mutual friend Abdullah and Tepli to ask our first question.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Yossi. Welcome back to Duke, my holy brother from the Holy Land. It's a wonderful, great honor to welcome you back. I would like to quickly preface my question. As you know, but people in the audience might not. To me, Israel's, as a society, and Israeli government's primary sincerity test for peace, reconciliation is not with the Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. Their primary sincerity test is 20% of their own citizens, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. They may be called in different names, but so one of the biggest component of Bibi Netanyahu's threat to Israeli democracy was his declaration of war to this 20% of Israeli society. doing everything they can. He was doing everything he could to further alienate the society, for the most part, that behaved. Given the conditions in the last 70 years of their citizenship in Israel, I think this society, on their part, against all odds, there were no violent terrorism. They were increasingly integrating the Israeli society in many ways. And despite nation-state bill and all the shenanigans that Bibi threw at them, they came in the third election with increased participation in Israeli democracy. So 3 main components that you have discussed: Corona crisis and government formation and the Trump peace plan. Where do these 20% Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, where are they? What are their dynamics? What are their dilemmas?
Well, Abdullah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because of everything that's happening in Israel in the last year, and especially the last months, the growing sense of uncertainty and political chaos. For me, the most hopeful development is really in the Arab-Israeli relationship with the Jewish-Israeli majority. Benny Gantz's most significant political move was exploring the possibility of creating a narrow government with the Arab United List, which is the 3rd largest party in the Knesset now. It has 15 Knesset members. And that list, the Arab parties have always been considered beyond the pale for coalition governments for valid reasons. And the main reason is that the Arab parties contain Knesset members, Arab Knesset members, who have in the past publicly supported terror attacks against Jews, some have supported Hezbollah or Hamas. You have, I would say, a more fundamental problem is that the Arab parties are in principle opposed to any Israeli military action on any front in any circumstance. And that's a very blanket statement, but that is the reality. And so how do you create a coalition government with Arab Knesset members who you know will oppose any Israeli act, even acts which the Jewish majority will agree from left to center to right are acts of self-defense? The Arab parties will oppose them. The deeper level here is that the Arab parties are committed, and I say parties because the United Arab List is actually a coalition of 4 different parties. One is Islamist, one is nationalist, one is pan-Arab. And so you have what all 4 parties agree on is opposition to Israel's self-definition as a Jewish state. And this creates an abyss in Israeli politics, because I think that the normative definition of Israel, and the definition which most Israeli Jews would agree to, is that Israel is 2 things. It is a Jewish state, by which we mean it is the homeland of every Jew, whether or not they are citizens of the state. And it is the state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. Now, that's a normative Israeli Jewish definition of Israeliness. The Arab parties do not share that basic self-definition. Nevertheless, everything you're saying, Abdullah, about the Arab-Israeli community is true. And so one of the great anomalies of Israeli politics is that you have an Arab-Israeli community which is integrationist-minded, a majority of whom will respond affirmatively when asked in polls, are you proud of being an Israeli? That's an amazing thing. A majority of Arab Israelis say they are proud to be Israelis. Now, I think if you asked the Knesset members, are you proud to be Israeli? I don't believe a single one would say that they are. So you have a built-in contradiction in Arab-Israeli politics. The question is, how do you navigate that? So what Benny Gantz did is break psychological red line by the mere fact that he was negotiating with the Arab list. That gives me a great deal of hope. Now, let me just say one last thing about this moment in terms of Arab-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli relations. This is Israel's first existential crisis that is not Jewish, that's not national. It's not our Arab neighbors declaring war against the existence of a Jewish state. That has been the definition of Israel's national crises in the past. This is our first civic national emergency. That creates a neutral space, a neutral Israeli space that is not explicitly Jewish, in which Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis can come together. And what makes this even more poignant is that the most integrated places, the most integrated spaces in Israeli society are the hospitals and clinics, the maternity wards. That's where Arabs and Jews encounter each other on a regular basis. 20% of Israeli doctors are Arab, which reflects exactly the percentage of Israelis, of Arabs in Israeli society. 30% of Israeli nurses, if not more, are Arab. 40% of Israeli pharmacists are Arab. So that the health system is our greatest success story for Arab-Jewish cooperation. And the fact that we are now facing a major national civic health emergency with this background of Benny Gantz breaking that red line of reaching out to the Arab list creates a convergence of circumstances which gives me real hope for seeing a breakthrough the morning after Corona.
Well, that's fascinating. Many thanks to both you and Abdullah for raising that issue. We're going to go to Becca Dudley for our next question.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for being here. This has been a fascinating conversation. So I have a question about President Trump's peace strategy. So his peace strategy was to get the Israelis to agree to a plan and then try to convince the Palestinians. But given that historically the problem has not really been Israel's willingness to agree to concessions, notably with Ehud Olmert's 2008 offer, do you think it would have been a better idea to do the complete opposite and get the Palestinians to agree and then approach the Israelis?
So let me say one word in defense of Jason Greenblatt, who headed the negotiating team, and who I know and respect, even though I think that, again, I think his plan falls quite short of being workable. But Greenblatt did reach out to the Palestinian leadership, and they broke off any avenues of conversation. I understand why they did from their point of view. I think it was unrealistic to expect that the Palestinian leadership would negotiate with Trump after moving the Jerusalem embassy to Jerusalem and taking other steps that I personally support as an Israeli. I understand from the Palestinian point of view why those were deal breakers, even to impediments to having even a conversation. What Jason Greenblatt did do, which I thought was the right move, was go to the Saudis and the Gulf states and try to create a web of support within the Arab world. I don't think that he succeeded in the sense that we didn't really see overt support. Where he did succeed was in neutralizing opposition, at least initially. That began to break down when the Arab League issued its statement opposing the plan. And so in the end, there was opposition, but it was very cautious opposition, and it left the door open. and the reason that I say that that's the right way to go is because my sense of how a two-state solution can emerge is that Israel will have to negotiate with the Arab world. I don't see an Israeli-Palestinian negotiating process leading to a two-state solution. Not in our time. I think that the two sides have such profound and well-earned mutual distrust that there is no way that we can reach an agreement. The Palestinian leadership is too weak. It doesn't have the support of its people. On the Israeli side, the mistrust toward Palestinian intentions has never recovered from the total breakdown during the Second Intifada. And so I don't see any reasonable chance of a two-state solution in that direction. But I do see Israel negotiating with parts of the Arab world and making the following trade-off: normalization with the Arab countries around us in exchange for a Palestinian state. That will be guaranteed in terms of security arrangements by Saudis, the Gulf states, and others. I don't think we're anywhere near ready for that. But if you look at what's happening in the region with a very interesting security relationship emerging, unprecedented, really, between Israel and the Saudis and the Gulf states, even Egypt lately, to counter Iran, I think that creates an infrastructure of relationships that can lead to that kind of a trade-off of normalization with the Arab world in exchange for a Palestinian state.
Well, I'm going to segue to a written question that came in that just what you were talking about at the very end, which was about Iran. Obviously, Iran has gotten a huge blow from Corona that has, I think, really shaken the foundations possibly of the regime. One thing, you could say, well, what's bad for Iran is good for Israel because it makes them weaker. But in international relations, we often see that when regimes are threatened internally, they act aggressively. They try to show they're strong against their external enemies in order to strengthen themselves internally. So I'm wondering how Israel is looking at the threat from Iran under the current circumstances, especially with regards to the potential of it restarting its nuclear program after the nuclear agreement has broken down.
Yeah, the working assumption in the security establishment here is the latter, that Iran is going to be far more dangerous the more desperate it gets. No one knows just how serious the Corona crisis really is in Iran. From what we are picking up, the crisis is severe, and the crisis is happening on different levels. There is a deepening crisis of confidence on the part of many people, certainly in the cities in Iran. And again, you have that radical breakdown between cities and the rural areas. And one can make a very loose comparison to the United States in that sense too. Politically, cities tend to be more liberal, and that does seem to be true in Iran. And don't forget that we just before Corona broke, the regime was already confronting a very serious crisis of confidence. There had been the mass demonstrations, and the regime killed 1,500 people, shot dead 1,500 citizens in the streets within a few days. And then there was the downing of the, forget what country was it? The airline was it a South Korean plane? I don't remember. Ukrainian plane. And that created tremendous rage in Iran because most of the people who were killed on the plane were Iranians traveling abroad. And so the government's credibility is already shaky. The sanctions that have been reimposed on the regime have severely weakened the Iranian economy, which I think is an essential step to undermine the regime. And so we're really looking at a convergence of threat. And the expectation here is that the regime is going to make some kind of a dramatic move in a nuclear direction and dare the international community to respond. And that this could be the moment when they go public with what we assume they are doing secretly in any case. And of course, there is the ongoing expansion of Iranian influence in the Arab world, though that has taken a serious hit in Iraq, especially in the last few months. Less so in Syria. In Syria, Iran is really entrenching, which is the greatest strategic threat to Israel that we're facing. We're seeing a growing Iranian presence on our border. We have, of course, Hezbollah on our northern border with Lebanon. Now we have literally Iranian forces on our northern border with Syria. So I expect the morning after Corona to be very much about the Iranian-Israeli.
We have a couple more students with questions, and Yossi, the time is getting late, and you're losing your voice a little bit. So thank you enough for. I see the tea as well. So why don't we have? We're going to have Jimmy, Jacob, and Elliot. So why don't we do this? Why don't we get some questions from all three of them? You can kind of jot down your notes, and then if you can try to respond. We can do it that way. So start us off, Jimmy. Give Yossi a little bit of rest for his voice too.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be long-winded then. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. Of course, and I thought you provided some really great and interesting and inspiring examples of how this coronavirus crisis could be a unifying force, in particular due to the structure of the Israeli healthcare system. I've been reading some articles about, particularly in the US, how the flip side of that is that the coronavirus has also been exacerbating tensions between certain groups by exposing or highlighting pre-existing inequalities. I'm thinking particularly of Black Americans being disproportionately affected by the coronavirus in the US. And I was just wondering if in Israel you've been observing any of that kind of dark side of this crisis as being a force to actually further drive a wedge between groups as opposed to being the unifying force that you were talking about in the healthcare system.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Do you want to take them one at a time, or do you want?
Yeah, let's do one at a time.
Absolutely, problem.
Not yet, though the potential for opening social fissures is very strong. I wouldn't define that along ethnic groupings, but more in terms of working class, middle class. Of course, there is some overlap, but that's what worries me more. If we don't start seeing some quasi-return to economic life in the next weeks, we're going to really be seeing a major certainly for the working class here. The real source of tension, of social tension that has opened up during the Corona experience has been with the ultra-Orthodox population. Close to half of hospitalization is from the ultra-Orthodox community. They live in very crowded, dense communities. They have very large families. They are a community that I would describe as having taken on a kind of voluntary poverty for the sake of devoting themselves full-time religious studies. On the one hand, there's something admirable and moving about that. On the other hand, as an Israeli taxpayer that helps subsidize those institutions, there's something deeply maddening about that arrangement. And Corona is a moment that has brought out a great deal of anger on the part of mainstream Israel toward the ultra-Orthodox community in ways that are really too complicated now to unpack. But I hope that we're also going to see a reevaluation of the very unhealthy relationship between the ultra-Orthodox community, which is about 10% of the Israeli public, and growing fast because of their large families, and the Israeli mainstream. In particular, the untenable relationship economically in the long term, socially as well, of a situation where we, the mainstream, subsidize the separatism of the ultra-Orthodox community. What we've learned in the Corona experience is that a modern society cannot afford to have such a large part of its population living in such extreme conditions of separatism from the rest of us.
Okay, we turn to Jacob Hochstein.
Okay, thank you again for being here today. And my question is about the ultra-Orthodox, specifically in Bnei Barak.
Jacob, we kind of lost your sound.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you.
Oh, my internet connection is unstable. Could I type the question instead?
Sure. We'll turn to Elliot and I'll read your question. Elliot Davis. Is Elliot there?
I am, sorry, just was getting unmuted.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for speaking. It was a really fascinating conversation, particularly on the Trump proposal for the future. So you've spoken a lot about how the composition of the Israeli government will impact the prospect of annexation. Can you speak about how the composition of the US government, specifically a Biden administration versus a re-elected Trump administration, would impact Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision-making on the question of annexation?
Well, there was a very interesting statement issued the other day by an organization called Democratic Majority for Israel, which is a pro-Israel coalition within the Democratic Party that was founded to counter the progressive or that part of the progressive wing that was anti-Israel. And the Democratic Majority sent an urgent message to both Netanyahu and Gantz, warning that any unilateral annexation of any part of the West Bank will create serious complications with large parts of the American political system. And of course, they were meaning a Biden administration. Biden, unlike Bernie, is unequivocally pro-Israel, a tried and true friend, and has a very, very intimate relationship with Israeli leaders. But I think that any annexationist move would be severely straining even Biden's goodwill. What worries me about the Biden administration is not its position on a two-state solution, which I would personally support, and I would welcome a Biden administration laying down red lines to both the Palestinians and both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. I think the step. But what worries me about a return to power of the Democrats is Iran. Would Biden try to reactivate the Iranian deal, the nuclear deal, which is perceived almost across the board politically in Israel as a disaster? And so the fear here is not so much on the Palestinian issue. There is that fear on the Israeli right, but in the Israeli center, the concern is more about Iran than the Palestinians.
Okay, Jacob writes about the situation in Bnei Barak, which many of our listeners might not know as deeply as he does, talking about the IDF having to go in to enforce social distancing and other matters. Could this be a clash point and a big problem if the IDF is essentially forced out of that area because they have deep health concerns? So maybe 2 sentences about what actually is happening there and your thoughts on that.
Well, Bnei Barak is Israel's largest ultra-Orthodox town. It borders greater Tel Aviv, which has created all kinds of concerns among secular Israelis who live in proximity to what has become the most serious outbreak of the virus in Israel. And it is in fact so serious that the IDF has been sent in to oversee the curfew and provide food and other supplies to families. Now, from what we're seeing, the IDF presence in Bnei Barak, with the exception of small groups of extremists who oppose any secular authority, we are seeing a real feeling of gratitude and warmth toward the IDF on the part of most of Bnei Barak. And that also is opens up very interesting possibilities for the morning after Corona. The question is, will the deep fissures in Israeli society, and we've dealt with 2 of them, the Arab Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox, which these are the 2 peripheral communities in Israeli society that are not yet part of the mainstream. Will this crisis lead to a drawing closer to the mainstream? Will the different parts of Israeli society understand that the way that we've structured our relationships are really untenable in moments of crisis? Or will this exacerbate those fissures? I want to be optimistic. I generally am optimistic about Israeli society. And we're certainly looking at long-term trends, but I do believe that Corona might be intensifying the resolution of those ongoing festering problems.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that final comment, and thank you to the students for all the questions. Very good questions, of course. And let me make one announcement and then a parting comment. We are going to have the AGS Career Panel, which we do annually on Zoom, on April 22nd at 1:30. Melanie will distribute the link. And of course, we understand all the difficulties and unsettled nature of people trying to get jobs and summer internships, and hopefully our panelists will be able to provide some advice next week on that. We traditionally, Yossi, we tend to close our AGS events with our dear leader, Peter Fever, making a cheesy joke about how deeply you need a AGS t-shirt. One day, hopefully soon, when you come to the U.S., we owe you a t-shirt. So
I look very much forward to picking that up in person.
Maybe Abdullah will bring it with him next time he goes to Israel as well. And my thanks, of course, to Abdullah for using his deep influence and personal connections to make this happen today.
Thank you all. And thank you, David.
Let me just say one other thing. Passover has ended in Israel. It will end, sundown will be here with us in another 4 or 5 hours in the United States. And what we say at the end of our Seders and the end of Passover is next year in Jerusalem. And that's very much an allegory. We don't all intend to go to Jerusalem, all the Jews, but it's an allegory that we all share a commonality, a common desire as Jewish people to be together, and this universalist spirit that would bring us to spiritually or metaphorically to Israel to be together. And we can only hope in these times that next Passover, at least we might not have achieved that with the coronavirus on the timetable we're on, but hopefully we'll be closer to that day that we can all share a global community together again. So with that, I want to thank you, Yossi, and we'll see you next year in Jerusalem.
Take care. Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Chag Sameach to all. Thank you, David, for this wonderful facilitation.
Thank you. And thank you, Abdullah.